The shouting started before sunrise, but by noon, the entire neighborhood would be surrounded by police. In a quiet suburban community where nothing unusual ever happened, a simple homeowners association dispute suddenly turned into something far more dangerous. Residents watched from their windows as flashing lights painted the street red and blue. Nobody expected the argument about property rules to go this far. It began with a warning letter. Michael Turner, a longtime resident known for keeping to himself, received a notice from the HOA demanding he remove a fence they claimed violated community guidelines. According to neighbors, it was the third letter he had received in 2 months. Each one more aggressive than the last. Michael ignored the first two, believing the rules were unfair. But this time, something changed. Witnesses said they heard shouting late the previous evening. HOA representatives had arrived at Michael's house, insisting he comply immediately. Voices grew louder. One neighbor claimed Michael shouted back, saying nobody had the right to step onto his property. By morning, workers hired by the HOA arrived with tools and paperwork. They planned to remove part of the fence themselves. That's when everything spiraled. Michael stepped outside, blocking the gate. Neighbors watched nervously as a heated argument exploded. Phones came out. Someone started recording. The workers backed away when they noticed Michael refusing to move. Within minutes, police were called. Officers arrived expecting a normal civil disagreement, but they quickly realized tension was dangerously high. Michael stood near his driveway, visibly angry, while HOA members demanded immediate action. The air felt heavy, like something was about to break. An officer tried calming everyone, asking both sides to step back. For a moment, it seemed the situation might settle. Then one HOA representative pointed toward the fence and said loudly, "We're removing it today, with or without permission." Silence fell. Michael's expression changed instantly. He moved toward his garage, and officers shouted for him to stop. Residents gasped as police rushed forward, unsure what he was reaching for. The street froze. Within seconds, additional patrol cars were requested. Officers created distance, telling neighbors to go inside. The peaceful neighborhood transformed into a tense standoff zone. From behind closed curtains, families watched in fear, wondering how a disagreement about rules had turned into something so serious. Negotiators arrived, speaking calmly through loudspeakers. Minutes felt like hours. Nobody knew what would happen next, only that one wrong move could change everything. And as the sun climbed higher, one question echoed through the neighborhood. How did an HOA complaint become a dangerous standoff? Because hidden behind years of frustration, rules, and quiet resentment, this conflict had been building much longer than anyone realized. The neighborhood felt unrecognizable. Police vehicles lined both sides of the street, their lights flashing silently now, creating a strange, tense calm. Officers moved carefully, speaking in low voices as they established a perimeter around Michael Turner's house. Residents watched through windows, whispering to each other, trying to understand how a simple HOA disagreement had grown so serious. Inside the barricade, negotiators attempted to talk calmly with Michael. He stood near his garage, refusing to step closer, his frustration obvious even from a distance. Officers kept their hands visible, careful not to escalate the situation further. Everyone knew one wrong move could push things beyond control. Across the street, HOA representatives argued among themselves. Some insisted they had legal authority to enforce the rules. Others suddenly looked unsure, realizing the situation had gone far beyond paperwork and fines. A neighbor recorded quietly, capturing every moment. As the standoff continued, police began learning more about Michael. He had lived there for over 15 years. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, but increasingly frustrated by repeated HOA fines, not just for the fence, but for parking, landscaping, and even the color of his mailbox. Each notice had added more pressure. One officer spoke softly into his radio. "This isn't just about a fence. He feels cornered." Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and tension hung heavy in the air. Negotiators asked Michael to step away from the garage and talk face to face. He shook his head, shouting that nobody listened until things reached this point. Meanwhile, social media videos started spreading. News crews arrived, cameras pointed at the house. What had started as a private dispute was now turning into a public spectacle. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor named Mrs. Alvarez stepped forward from behind the police line. She knew Michael for years and asked officers if she could speak. After hesitation, they allowed her closer, carefully monitored. She called out gently, reminding Michael about better days, barbecues, neighborhood gatherings, times before the arguments started. Her voice cut through the tension like sunlight through clouds. Michael's expression softened for the first time. But the calm didn't last long. One HOA member, frustrated and impatient, shouted from behind officers, demanding police, "End this already." The words echoed across the quiet street. Michael's face hardened again. He stepped backward toward the garage, and officers immediately tensed. Negotiators raised their voices, trying to keep communication open. The situation had reached a dangerous balance, fragile, unpredictable. Suddenly, a loud metallic sound came from inside the garage. Officers moved into position. Residents gasped. Cameras zoomed in. Nobody knew what Michael was doing, only that the standoff had entered a new, more dangerous phase. And as the afternoon heat pressed down on the silent street, everyone realized this was no longer just about HOA rules. It was about control, pride, and years of growing anger, now seconds away from exploding. The metallic sound echoed again from inside the garage, loud enough to make officers flinch. Hands tightened on radios. The negotiator raised his voice, calmly asking Michael to step away and keep his hands visible. The entire street held its breath. Michael reappeared slowly, holding a large toolbox. Relief spread through some of the officers. It wasn't a weapon, but tension remained thick in the air. He set the box down heavily, frustration clear on his face. "I'm done being pushed around," he shouted. "They keep coming onto my property like I don't matter." The negotiator nodded, encouraging him to talk. Every word mattered now. Officers knew the goal wasn't force, it was patience. Across the street, residents whispered nervously. News cameras continued rolling, broadcasting the scene live. People online debated who was right, but those standing there felt only fear. Nobody wanted the situation to get worse. Michael continued speaking, anger mixed with exhaustion. He explained how the HOA had fined him repeatedly, how letters kept arriving, how he felt targeted. The fence, he said, was just the last straw. Each notice made him feel smaller inside his own home. The negotiator listened carefully, repeating his words back to show understanding. For a moment, the tension softened again. Officers lowered their shoulders slightly. Then a sudden argument broke out behind the police line. Two HOA members began yelling at each other, one insisting they should leave, the other demanding enforcement. Their shouting carried across the street. Michael heard it. His expression changed instantly. He kicked the toolbox, metal clanging loudly, and stormed back toward the garage. Officers shouted for him to stop. The negotiator pleaded calmly, telling him to stay where he was. But Michael disappeared inside. The atmosphere snapped tight like a stretched wire. Police prepared for the worst-case scenario, quietly repositioning. Residents were ordered farther back. Even the news crew lowered their voices, sensing how serious things had become. Minutes passed. No movement, no sound. The silence was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, the garage door began to open again. Michael stepped out holding something long wrapped in cloth. Officers immediately raised their voices, ordering him to put it down. Cameras zoomed in. Nobody could see clearly what it was, but the tension exploded instantly. Michael's hands trembled. He shouted that he only wanted to be heard, that nobody listened unless things got serious. The negotiator kept talking softly, trying to calm him down. "Mrs. Alvarez called out again, begging him to stop. For a second, he hesitated. That hesitation gave officers hope, but also fear, because everyone knew the next seconds would decide everything. The wrapped object slipped slightly in his hands. Officers moved forward cautiously, and then, from the crowd, someone screamed. The fragile balance shattered. The standoff had reached its most dangerous moment yet, and nobody knew how it would end. The scream cut through the street like a shockwave. Officers reacted instantly, shouting commands while keeping their distance. The negotiator raised his hands, urging everyone to stay calm. Michael froze, startled by the sudden noise, the wrapped object still trembling in his grip. Cameras captured every second as tension reached its breaking point. "Michael, listen to my voice," the negotiator said slowly. "No one wants anyone hurt today. The object slipped again, and finally the cloth fell away. It wasn't a weapon. It was a broken section of the fence. A wave of confusion swept through the crowd. Officers paused, realizing the danger wasn't what they feared. Michael held the damaged wood up like proof, shouting that this was all he wanted them to see, the part the wall had tried to remove without his consent. The mood shifted slightly, but the emotional tension remained high. Michael's face showed years of frustration pouring out all at once. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was desperate to be heard. The negotiator stepped closer, carefully. "You've made your point," he said softly. "Now let's end this safely." Across the street, even the HOA members looked uncertain. The situation had spun out of control far beyond their expectations. Some lowered their heads, realizing how badly communication had failed. Michael's shoulders dropped. The anger that had fueled him all day started to drain away, leaving exhaustion behind. He looked around at the police, the neighbors, the cameras, suddenly aware that his private frustration had become public spectacle. "Mrs. Alvarez spoke gently again, reminding him he wasn't alone. Her calm voice grounded him. Slowly, Michael placed the broken fence piece on the ground. Officers relaxed slightly but stayed alert. The negotiator nodded encouragingly, asking him to step away from the garage. After a long pause, Michael finally obeyed, walking forward with trembling hands raised. The crowd released a collective breath. Police guided him safely to the side, not with force, but with quiet reassurance. The standoff that had gripped the neighborhood for hours was finally ending. But the story wasn't over. As officers spoke with both sides, reporters uncovered more details. HOA rules had been inconsistently enforced. Complaints were filed without proper discussion. Residents admitted fear of speaking up. What happened today wasn't just one man losing his temper, it was years of growing resentment finally exploding into public view. The sun began setting, casting long shadows across the street. Police started removing barriers. Neighbors slowly stepped outside, talking quietly about what they had witnessed. Michael sat on the curb, exhausted, watching as workers secured the damaged fence. And just as calm returned, a new question began spreading among residents. If this could happen once, how many other neighborhoods were one argument away from chaos? The dangerous standoff was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The flashing police lights faded as evening settled over the neighborhood, but the tension didn't disappear with them. Residents stood in small groups, replaying what they had witnessed, speaking in hushed voices. The street looked normal again, yet nothing felt the same. Michael sat quietly on the curb while officers finished paperwork nearby. His anger had dissolved into exhaustion. Neighbors who once avoided him now looked at him differently, not as a threat, but as someone pushed too far. Still, the seriousness of what had happened weighed heavily on everyone. Across the street, HOA members gathered for an emergency discussion. Their confident tone from earlier was gone. Cameras and public attention had forced them into uncomfortable reflection. Some blamed poor communication. Others quietly admitted their enforcement methods had become too aggressive. News reporters continued interviewing residents. Stories emerged quickly. Warning letters over minor issues, fines that felt excessive, neighbors afraid to challenge the system. The standoff had exposed tensions that had existed quietly for years. Police officers spoke with Michael calmly. Because he had not used violence, the focus shifted toward de-escalation and mediation rather than punishment. The negotiator explained that the goal was to prevent future conflicts, not create more. As darkness fell, something unexpected happened. A few neighbors approached Michael. One offered water. Another simply said, "We understand now." The small gestures carried more power than words. For the first time that day, Michael's expression softened with relief. Meanwhile, the HOA president gave a short statement to the media, promising to review enforcement policies and rebuild trust within the community. Some residents applauded, others remained skeptical. The broken fence still lay near the driveway, silent evidence of how quickly small disputes could spiral. Later that night, a community meeting was announced for the following week. Everyone would be invited. Rules, fines, and communication methods would all be discussed openly. The neighborhood wanted answers, and change. But as calm returned, officers reviewing body camera footage noticed something important. Several moments during the standoff could have ended very differently if emotions had escalated just slightly more. The reality hit hard. This had come dangerously close to becoming a tragedy. The negotiator walked past the damaged bridge-style fence and paused, reflecting on the day. People don't snap overnight, he said quietly. Pressure builds quietly, until it erupts. The street lights flickered on one by one. Families returned indoors. News vans slowly packed up. Michael stood, looked at his house, and finally stepped inside, closing the door gently. Outside, silence settled again, peaceful but thoughtful. Yet one question lingered in the air as the neighborhood processed everything that had happened. Could this community truly change, or was another conflict waiting just beneath the surface? Because tomorrow, when everyone woke up, they wouldn't just face rules and fences anymore. They would face the truth about how close they came to disaster, and the hard choices required to move forward. 1 week later, the neighborhood gathered in the community hall, a place usually reserved for quiet meetings and holiday events. This time, every seat was filled. The dangerous standoff had changed the atmosphere completely. People arrived not just curious, but determined to be heard. The HOA board sat at the front, looking far less confident than before. Cameras were gone, but the weight of public attention remained. Residents whispered as Michael entered the room quietly. Some nodded at him, others simply watched, unsure how to act after everything that happened. The meeting began with silence. Then the HOA president stood and spoke carefully, acknowledging that mistakes had been made. Enforcement had become too rigid. Communication had broken down. The situation with the fence should never have escalated to the point where police were called. Murmurs spread through the crowd. For the first time, residents openly shared their experiences. Stories poured out. Warning letters over small issues, fines that felt unfair, neighbors feeling powerless to challenge decisions. What once stayed hidden now filled the room with raw honesty. Michael eventually stood up. The room quieted instantly. He apologized for how far things went but explained how years of frustration made him feel trapped in his own home. His voice shook slightly as he spoke, not with anger now, but with relief at finally being heard. Something shifted in the room. People began seeing the conflict differently, not as one man versus rules, but as a community that had stopped listening to itself. After hours of discussion, changes were proposed. Clearer communication policies, mediation before penalties, resident votes on major decisions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Outside, the damaged fence remained as a reminder of the chaos that nearly turned tragic. Instead of removing it immediately, residents decided to leave part of it standing temporarily, a symbol of what happens when small problems grow ignored. Days later, repair crews finally arrived. The street looked calm again. Children played outside as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew things had changed beneath the surface. Michael helped rebuild the fence himself, joined quietly by neighbors who once avoided him. Even a few HOA members offered assistance. The scene felt almost surreal, the same people who stood on opposite sides now working together. The negotiator stopped by briefly, watching from a distance. He smiled, knowing the best outcomes often come not from force, but from understanding. As the sun set over the peaceful neighborhood, the standoff became a story people would remember for years, not just because it was dangerous, but because it forced everyone to face uncomfortable truths. Rules mattered, safety mattered, but
The
listening mattered
neighborhood
more.
moved forward, wiser and more careful, aware that harmony isn't automatic. It takes effort from everyone, and in the end, the biggest lesson remained clear. The most dangerous standoff didn't start with anger; they start when people stop talking. If you enjoyed don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments.